Okay, it's time for us to begin. It's time for us to get started. In fact, it's past time, and I appreciate everybody being here. The doors will be closing in a minute, so if everyone can find a seat, we'll be ready to begin. And we're continuing our study of the theme of providence in the Old Testament. Not that there's any substantial difference in providence in principle between how it functions in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but we have different examples, different statements made about it that will help clarify it for us. One of the things you discover, as you know, when you study the Old Testament, is many New Testament principles get illuminated by the examples of people and events that you study in the Old Testament. And that's certainly the way it is with providence. Okay, let's have our quiz, if we can remember from last week. What is... Now, don't everybody speak at once because it would be difficult to hear you, but someone raise your hand, let's say, and tell me the difference between special providence and general providence. Of course, these aren't Bible words. It's not as though you have to know these in order to go to heaven or something, but it helps to classify in our minds the different ways in which God provides. I think these are helpful terms, even though they're not in the Bible. Special providence or general providence? Yeah. Well, it could be, but that's not how we characterized it last week. A good bit of it is miraculous, but special providence is still a broader category. So someone help us out. What did we say last week? Yes, sir. Right. And general is, as opposed to special. He said specific things for specific people. That's right. But general providence is what? Yeah, generally provided to everybody, such as rain and sunshine. But special providence is where God gives a particular blessing for a particular person or group. Now, Brother Juan said miraculous. Well, some of it is miraculous and some of it's not. In fact, does God bless us with special providence? Yes, because remember, we're His children, and children have the special prerogative of asking and receiving. Remember, that's, for example, Matthew 7, ask and you shall receive. Well, what about the atheist who never asks? Does he receive? Well, he receives some things, but not everything that the child of God receives. What about James 5:16? The effectual fervent prayer of a what? Of a righteous man avails much. Well, doesn't that indicate that the person who's an unrighteous man who doesn't pray is not effective? In other words, he doesn't get the same thing that a person who is a righteous person who prays gets. So that's special providence, and some of it is miraculous and some of it's not. Okay, number 2, true or false? Well, I answered this, didn't I? Special providence always is miraculous. False, because we're not asking God when we pray to do a miracle, are we? We recognize that we don't live in the age of miracles because of 1 Corinthians 13, verses 8 through 13, and other passages too, but mainly the prominent one is 1 Corinthians 13. So we're not asking God to do something that God said He wouldn't do, but we're asking God to give us special providence nonetheless. Does everybody understand that? Okay, good. Number 3, give an example of special providence from the Old Testament. Of course, there are many, and you could give a miraculous one or a non-miraculous one. So I've really left it wide open. So think about anyone. Raise your hand and give me one. Y'all have been kind of quiet so far, so help me out. Well, Roger, you already went. So I'm going to go to somebody else. You got all the notes. Well, somebody else may have all the notes too, unless maybe they copied from you. I don't know. Okay. Oh, it's good. So many examples of providence in that whole discussion of the exodus of Israel from Egyptian bondage. And was some of that miraculous? In fact, most of the examples we would think of would be miraculous. All the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, all of that certainly was. Okay? What else? I heard Noah. Is that Noah? And so God provided miraculously and non-miraculously. Could we think of it in both ways? Okay, God miraculously spoke to Noah and told him to build the ark. He didn't do that for everybody. But water has the natural properties that it does. So when the ark became buoyant, that was because, presumably, water does what water does. So that's a natural aspect of providence. But it was a worldwide flood in which God remembered Noah and his family. According to Genesis 8:1, God remembered Noah and his family and took care of them. And I suppose much of that care was supernatural during the flood. So isn't that a beautiful case where miraculous special providence and non-miraculous special providence is working together? See that? Okay, anybody else want to bring up an example? It's perfectly fitting for us to spend a bunch of time on this question because that's what our section is about last week and this week, providence in the Old Testament. So another example. Yes, sir. Okay, what about it? Good. Excellent. So Daniel's life was spared by the sending of the angel in the lion's den in Daniel 6. But there was actually, I would suggest, also some non-miraculous special providence going on, because there's no indication that God worked a miracle in order to put Daniel in the position he had as one of the princes in Babylon. He was chosen, and I would suggest that God worked that out so that he would be in the position he was, but it wasn't supernatural. The saving of Daniel from the lion's den was supernatural. The setting up of the lion's den, as far as we know, wasn't. It's not as though God gave a prophecy or something to King Darius and said, set up the lion's den and so forth. Some bad guys did that, right? Some of the jealous satraps or princes had the lion's den set up. Okay, very good. What else? Okay, good. Well, the book of Daniel has a lot of it in there, and certainly chapter 3 is a real good example where some angel, or perhaps even the pre-incarnate Christ, appeared with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. Okay, one more and then we'll move on. Yes, sir. Very good. Okay, the maintenance of the line of Judah. And remember, Genesis 49:10 had said that the scepter, or the ruling authority, would not depart from Judah until Shiloh, which is another word for Christ, the peace bringer, until Shiloh came. And so God allowed the messianic line through the tribe of Judah to continue until Jesus came. And it came nigh unto extinction, it seems, especially in the case of the deportation to Babylon and the situation with Esther and Haman. Very good. Okay, number 4. What was the historical occasion of the writing of the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles? What was going on? Just in general. You can give a one-sentence explanation of that. Remember, we said in last week and this week we're going to focus in on Chronicles, and so we need to say what was going on. Yes, sir. Right, the return of the exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem, and then consequently the rebuilding of the temple and the setting up of the Jewish religion again in Palestine. And that's why we have the books of the Chronicles, because the people needed encouragement in the ways we're going to see in just a few minutes. Okay, number 5. What was one of the purposes of the genealogies in 1 Chronicles 1 through 9? Not that the text explicitly says, here's why these genealogies are being given, but due to the historical context, we can figure out what the purpose of those genealogies was. Okay, what would you say? We gave several purposes last week. Well, Christ's genealogy is involved. I don't know if I don't know how they could have understood that, but I don't want to rule that out. Yes, sir? Yeah, okay, so tribal affiliation was very important for several reasons. And one was you needed to know where your land was. Okay, the land had been divided up in the book of Joshua at the end of throughout, from chapters 10 on, the tribal allotments had been given. So you needed to know where you were supposed to live. And then what else? The breakdown of the tribes so that the Levites could be identified. Because you want to make sure that the priesthood is operating according to the book of Leviticus, which means the Levites, certain ones of the Levites, had to be the priests. So that was very important. Okay, very good. And more things that we'll maybe say in a minute. So here we are on November 14th, and next week, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen. Brother Quint is filling in next week. So he may decide to go on with and go to creation in Genesis 1 and 2, or he may do something different next week. I'm going to be in Missouri with my wife's family next week due to Thanksgiving. But Quint is going to be filling in, and he always does an excellent job when he teaches. So be here for that if you're in town. And he may cover creation or he may do something else. Okay, we've already been indicating some matters related to this, but let's give an example or two. God will stay involved and keep on providing. There's a line of thought called deism, which is the view that God created the world but then became uninvolved, that God sort of created the world and stepped away. Maybe like a clockmaker who winds up a clock and then walks away and forgets about it. And so the clock is not attended to, and it just winds down however it will without any intervention. Some people think that God, they'll say if God did create the world, he created it, but then he had nothing to do with it after that. But that's against the biblical doctrine of providence, because providence teaches not only that God sustains the universe, that God keeps it going, Colossians 1:16 and 17, but also he intervenes in it. He provides things for it, not just keeping it in existence, but provides for it, even on the level of sending rain, giving food to eat, but then also that he will intervene in the natural course of the laws. The laws of nature are regularities that we observe, where, for example, in the law of gravity, everything always goes downward. Everything with any weight goes downward. And that's just how it goes. But God can intervene so that we get a glimpse of a realm where those laws are not applicable, where, for example, a person can ascend up to heaven, as Jesus did, and as Elijah did, and as Enoch seems to have done. So we can get a glimpse of a realm where those principles do not apply. That's a miracle, or an event that cannot be produced by the ordinary regularities of nature, an effect that nature could not cause. So those are examples of miraculous special providence. Even whether we're talking about miraculous or non-miraculous, the point is God is involved. God is intervening. So that's what the doctrine of providence shows us in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But let's give an example before we get to Chronicles. Let's look back at Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15. And this will show you how prophecy can be fulfilled over hundreds of years by virtue of God's participation in the world, God's intervention. This is right after Adam and Eve sinned. Okay, let's read verse 14 beginning. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity or opposition between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Okay, that's widely taken to be the first prophecy about Christ, that he would be the one who would come and crush Satan on the head, even though Satan would bruise Christ on the heel. The difference is a crush on the head is a fatal blow, but a bruise on the heel is, while an injury, not a fatal blow. If we look over in the New Testament, we find a passage like Revelation 12:17, where the dragon, who represents Satan, is enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children. And if you study that context, I think you'll find that the woman's children are the church in the Christian age. And the children are the ones who keep, chapter 12, verse 17 of Revelation, keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So remember, Genesis 3:15 says, here's enmity or opposition between the serpent and the woman. And then when we turn to Revelation, which is about the devil's attempt to try to lead the church into apostasy, to try to lead Christians to be lost, you find again this enmity or opposition between the devil and the serpent. Also, Romans 16 and verse 20 says, here's Paul to the Roman Christians, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. So, what's the crushing of the devil's head? It's the salvation of souls. That is, the making it so that people aren't under the power of the devil so they have to go to hell. So the Roman Christians, because they were in Christ, would be the ones who are the recipients of this blessing of the crushing of Satan's head. But of course, that takes thousands of years to unfold. And God orchestrates human history from the very first prophecy right after the sin of Adam and Eve over the course of 6,000 years, and now more than 6,000 years, to the point where Christians are being saved and the head of Satan is being crushed. There's a sense in which we could say every time a Christian goes to heaven, it's a crushing of Satan's head because he was powerless. As far as that person's salvation is concerned, the devil's head was crushed. He had no capability to make that person be lost. The devil had power over people, but when Christ died on the cross and made it so that people's sins could be forgiven, the devil lost that power. So see how there's a prophecy that is overarching human history. And other prophecies don't take that long until their fulfillment is reached, but they are nonetheless fulfilled. Every promise of God has come true. Another example would be the Israelite inheritors of the promised land. God, of course, promises back in Genesis 12 to Abraham that his descendants would occupy the land where he was a sojourner in the land of Canaan. And then, at the end of the book of Joshua, chapters 23 and 24, when Joshua is giving his farewell address, he says that none of the promises that God had given to the Israelites had failed to come to pass. He had given them everything he promised them. But look back and consider all the events that had to take place in order for that promise to be fulfilled, including the Israelites going and spending 450 years as servants of the king of Egypt. That seems like an unpredicted, well, it was predicted in Genesis 15 that would happen, that they would be slaves in Egypt, but an unexpected, I should say, unexpected detour. And we would like, of course, God to fulfill all his promises to us in the immediate sometimes. We would like for him to give us every blessing that he ever has for us right now. We have a time preference that way, kind of like the prodigal son who said, give me my inheritance now. We would like to have it all now, but God sometimes gives us those blessings through a twisty-turny road, things that we do not expect. And the Israelites, of course, were sojourners in Egypt for all that time, but through their deliverance from Egypt, God did fulfill every promise that he had ever given to the nation of Israel. All of God's care for them, including the parting of the Red Sea, feeding them with the manna and the quail, leading them with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire through the wilderness, protecting them by giving them not just food to eat, but water that came from the rock, leading them all that time. All that providence led to the total fulfillment of all those promises. Now, when we think about our own lives, we can see that God promises us that it will work out for our good, Romans 8:28. He doesn't promise that everything will be good. He doesn't promise us all good events, but he promises us a good life overall. That's what the verse promises, not good events. In fact, most of the events may be bad, but he promises us a good life, that all the events will work together to produce a tapestry that is for our benefit. Even difficult things will be woven together for our benefit. And that's how God's providence works. Sometimes it's easier to see how it works by looking to the past than to look in the immediate present, because in the present we don't see how the difficulties will produce the good outcome. But if we look in the past, we can see, yes, when I was faithful, here are how the things worked out for my good. Over maybe decades, we can see how I was faithful and then this worked out. And I wouldn't be where I am now with the benefits that I have if I hadn't endured and remained faithful through all those struggles. So I see then how it worked out, looking in the past. That's why the Old Testament's so valuable. In a way, one of the reasons is because we can look and see how the faithfulness of Israel produced, with God's providence, all of these good outcomes, the fulfillment of all of his promises. All right, any questions or comments? These are just examples, and we could add to the list. In fact, y'all have already added to the list in answering the quiz question. but we could add to this list. Anybody want to make a comment about any of that? Yes, sir. Right, yeah. Right, that's a very good point, isn't it? We may do a lot of things that God is using as part of His providential working, and we become deceived into thinking that we produced it all ourselves. Well, we may be involved, but God is the one who's weaving all that together. And I think the way this shows up in James, you said in the book of James we see this. The passage in there that comes to my mind is chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, where James says, you don't have because you do not ask. Well, later in the chapter, you read about these guys who were saying they would go into a far country and buy and sell and get gain. And James says, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will do that. Well, here's people who didn't recognize His providence. They're saying, we're producing all of the outcome of our business ourselves, and God really has nothing to do with it. We're going to go do this. We will buy and sell, get gain for ourselves, not thinking there's anybody else involved. But there's always somebody else involved. In the life of a Christian, God is the one who's providing. And even in the life of a non-Christian, God is providing the goods that they're able to work with. Doesn't mean God approves of all their actions, but God is still providing for them to make it so they can do anything that they do. So if we realize that God is the one who's ultimately in charge and God's providence is operative, it's real, then we'll ask God. We will say, work it out for this particular benefit. Remember Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says, we let our requests be made known. Our requests could have an impact on the providence. Our requests could make it so that God works out the providence differently. Otherwise, why would we ask? Okay, comment. Yeah, if we pray sincerely, not doubting, which chapter 1 of James, verse 6 says, we've got to ask in faith, nothing doubting. We're expressing confidence in His providence. We're saying, we know that all of our blessings come from you, chapter 1, verse 17 of James. Wow, James says a lot about providence, doesn't it? When you say, all of this ultimately is from you, so please fix it the way I would like it. And nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Expressing trust that even though you may have a different plan from the one I would prefer, that my trust is still in you. And that's the sincere prayer of a Christian, is I believe in your providence. And I believe in your providence even more than I believe in my preference. That's a difficult thing to pray. Isn't that a lot of trust? To tell God, here's what I would prefer. For example, I would prefer this person not be sick. Or I would prefer that I have a job rather than not have a job. Or I would prefer, think about the big crises that come up in life. I would prefer to not deal with this crisis rather than deal with it. That's my preference. But I trust providence more than I trust my preference. And that's tough. That's a tough prayer. But isn't that the way a faithful Christian prays? Because do you believe in the wisdom of the fatherhood of God? Do you believe that He really knows better than you? Well, I think a lot of people will confess that. They'll say, I always believe God knows better than me, until God allows me to suffer something I don't want to suffer. And then I think I know better than God. Then I sort of put on my divine boots and I think I should be God. Because if I were God, this wouldn't be happening. Well, it may be true, but you're not, and He's the only one who really knows. So we have to, that's where the rubber meets the road about trusting God. When everything's going great, we can just say thank you. That's great. But when things aren't, and we pray that things will be different, and they're not immediately different, that's when we have to say, I trust God's providence. Okay. We'll say a few more things about that in the lesson today because I don't want to preach the lesson today, but I don't want to preach it right now, that is. Okay, what about Joseph? We'll mention Joseph in Genesis 50 and verse 20, where Joseph talked about his time in slavery in Egypt after his brethren sold him down there. And he said, you meant that for evil, talking to his brothers. But God meant it for good. When it says God meant it for good, that shows intentionality prior to the fact. Consider that for a minute. That God looked at what was going to happen to Joseph and meant that. That is, he saw the future and said, I have a purpose for Joseph being in slavery for much of his adult life. And Joseph did not know that. But God had a purpose for it. And he looks in retrospect. That's why I'm saying it helps to look in retrospect. And that's why the Old Testament's so valuable. We look in retrospect and say, now I see what God was doing. But is there any way Joseph could have seen what God was doing? He didn't know about the famine. And he didn't know that somebody who was in prison in Egypt could wind up being the manager of finance for the whole country during a famine. Did he have any experience with that? And he didn't know that his brothers would wind up being indebted to him as a result of a famine. See how many things God had in store that Joseph had no clue about when he went into slavery? And then he got out of it and said, oh, well, God meant this for good. God saw what was going to happen and put me in the right place. Or maybe Esther, in Esther 4:14, she was come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Well, she had no idea about that time. She didn't know that there was going to be a person named Haman who would try to eradicate the Jews and that she would need to be in that position to intercede so that Haman would be killed instead of the entire nation, so the seed line of Christ could be preserved. She didn't know anything about that. But how many times has the same thing happened in our lives? Not that we're the Queen of Persia or something like that, but that something happened that we could not have anticipated. And we look back and say, oh, that's why God put me, presumably. We don't have divine revelation, but it sure does seem that that's why God orchestrated it this way, so that I would be ready for working in some such way. Okay, well, we'll pass on from there, and now let's notice, I mentioned Genesis 49:10, the scepter would not depart from Judah until the Messiah came. And then, if you look from then on at certain passages, how that the scepter did not depart from Judah, but that Judah always maintained a degree of autonomy. Even during captivity days, there were people in Judah with a Jewish governor, while most of the people were away in captivity. There was still a Jewish governorship. Now, granted, it was under the thumb of the Babylonians and the Persians, but there was always local Israelite authority in Judea all through those centuries. And Jeremiah says God's going to bring the people back from captivity after 70 years. There's chapter 25, verse 12. And he's going to make a new covenant with them, chapters 31 and 33. And Jeremiah in chapter 32 even buys land that his family can inhabit after the return. That's putting your money where your mouth is, isn't it? To say, I know I'm never going to get to use this land. I'm going to die in Egypt. But my ancestors, not my ancestors, but my descendants will come back from Babylonian captivity, and they're going to be able to use the land. So that just shows his confidence. Much like Joseph saying that his bones needed to be brought back to the land of Canaan, showing that God was going to fulfill the promise that the Israelites would be there, that they would conquer that land so he could be buried there. Well, Jeremiah says this land is going to be possessed and inhabited, and land is going to be bought and sold here again. And so here's his confidence that God's providence is going to work through all these things. Well, Galatians 4:4 says, remember, that this new covenant through Christ would come in the fullness of time. Well, when is the fullness of time? Sometimes people will say, why do we have the Old Testament? Given that God promises the Savior in Genesis 3:15, why did the world have to wait 4,000 years between Genesis 3:15 and Matthew 1. Why couldn't Jesus just come right then, solve the problem? Ultimately, all those answers are in the mind of God, but we know it was at the right time, according to Galatians 4. And we know that the law of Moses had to come in between because it was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. That's the end of Galatians 3. And we know that there were a number of factors in world history that made the spread of the gospel to people all over the world possible, so that by the time Paul wrote Colossians, he could say that the gospel had been spread to all the parts of the world, Colossians 1:23. And we know that God made a uniform language that everyone could speak. So God foresaw the conflict that came at the Tower of Babel, all those problems. He gave the different languages then, but he gave a universal language, providentially, that would be Greek, that people could speak in the first century so that the gospel could be promulgated. He sent all the prophets over the centuries leading up to the time when Christ would come so that people could be ready for him. So there are any number of factors. We don't know all of them because we're not in the mind of God, but it was at the right time. And the Old Testament is that prelude that brings us up to the right time, both for the people who lived those events and those of us who are reading those events, coming up to the time Jesus would come. But that's all providence over all of those centuries. Okay, we're going to look at Chronicles now. Let's look at some of the things that God says about these people as they come back and about God's provision for them. This is for me, one of the most exciting sections of Scripture for providence. Let's look at 1 Chronicles 9. This is at the end of the genealogies, okay? Chapter 9, verse 1. And right off the bat here, you get the practical effect of the genealogies, which sometimes we read over and think, this is no good for us. This is boring. Well, it may seem boring to us, but it was absolutely critical for them. This was as critical as your address. This was as critical as your phone number. You mean, and more, because it had a much more spiritual significance. You can change your phone number. You can't change your tribe if you're a Jewish person. Even though you need to know your phone number, you can change it. You can't change your tribe. You can change your address. You can move to another house, but if you're of Israel, you're of a particular tribe, and you need to know which one you belong to. So all Israel, verse 1 says, was enrolled by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. Incidentally, we don't know what that book is. That's not 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just some book we don't know about. And Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Of course, all those people would have known that because they're the ones who are coming back from that exile. Now, the first who lived in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Here are people who are Levites who are not of the southern tribes. You know, the Levites were scattered around among all the tribes. So they are not, that's why it says people who were Israel, not Judah. Some of the sons of Judah, of the sons of Benjamin, and of the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. Uthai, the son of Ammihud, the son of Omri, and so on after that. So here is the indication of the necessity of these genealogies, as we said, putting them in the right tribe. So they are legitimate covenant heirs because they are practicing the covenant. And Chronicles verifies that these people, when they practice Israelite law, are participating in the covenant with Moses just as surely as the people were before they went off into captivity. So if some of the people were tempted to think, because God abandoned us and let us go away into Nebuchadnezzar's grip for 70 years, that there's no way the covenant still applies to us. It's not for me. You know, that was my great-great-grandfather. He was under the law of Moses before the exile, but not me. Well, Chronicles corrects that. Isn't it sometimes tempting for people to think, well, the law that we read about in the Bible is for a bygone generation. That's not for me. It has nothing to do with me. You know, Christianity is just for old ladies and babies. It's not for normal adults, regular people. It's for maybe super Christians or something like that. It's not for common, ordinary people. No, that's just not the case, is it? The Bible is for everybody in every generation. So the people needed to know it was for them. Notice they are legitimate heirs of old Israel. When God promised the certain parts of the land to Abram, and then it was divided up in Joshua for the different tribes, these people participated in those promises just as surely as those in previous generations had. So Chronicles confirms that. Then notice that all Israel is going to be included in the Davidic kingdom, or the kingdom of David. Now this is huge. There may be two huge concepts in Chronicles. One is the Davidic kingdom, and emphasizing to the people that they're part of that, even though there's no king on the throne in the way that David and Solomon and Saul and then subsequent kings ruled. They're ruled by a Jewish governor under oversight of a world power, the Persians. But still, they are heirs to that promise. They are participating in the same line of God's providential care through the throne of David. Let's look back at chapter 17, 1 Chronicles 17. And here is the covenant with David. And I want to read, we don't have time to read the whole chapter here. Let's read beginning in verse 9. I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place, and not be moved again, and the wicked will not waste them any more as formerly, even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will subdue all your enemies. Moreover, I tell you that the Lord will build a house. This is God speaking to David, a house for you. When your days are fulfilled, that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build for me a house. That was Solomon, of course. And I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him who was before you. Notice that's the distinction between Saul's monarchy and David's. Is Saul's ended after one generation. Jonathan did not get to be the king. The descendants of Saul were not the kings. The descendants of David, from David until the exile, they were all of the same family. There's one dynasty, as opposed to the many dynasties that happened in the northern kingdom, where one family would assassinate somebody from the other family who was the king. All these different dynasties. When you get to look at the southern kingdom, and remember Chronicles is just about the southern kingdom. It's exclusively dealing with that history because that's what's relevant for them. That they serve in the same kingdom that has been established forever. And that's this kingdom of David. Okay, it's forever. His throne shall be established forever. Verse 15, according to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. And we won't take the time to read all of these other passages. You can have the slide if you want, if you give me your email address. But if you go through all of these, you'll find that this Davidic messianic line applied to them. And so they needed to know that God had a plan for them that he was still working out through them. Now think about ourselves and the mission that God is accomplishing through the church. Do we not need to be told that God appointed the apostles initially to take the gospel to the world, but that we still are charged with the same basic mission and that we're still part of evangelizing the world? Every generation has to be evangelized, and there aren't any apostles living to do it now, so it's up to us to be the ones who do it wherever we're located. So God is active, God is present with his people to help. Chronicles says God is going to take care of the people no matter what happens. God is going to rule through the house of David continually through these governors and not through usurpers. And then we make it practical to us that God is just as with us as he was with the people of Israel who came back from captivity, and that God will provide for us, not just for the physical needs like Matthew 6:33 says, but also with the confidence in our salvation and that we have a mission that cannot be separated from even the mission really that the Israelites had, because that was bringing about the messianic line which produced salvation, and we're taking that message about the Messiah to the world. So you see how there's this continuity of mission that goes back all through the Old Testament with the Israelites and continues today. Okay, somebody want to make a comment or a question? Let's think about this for a moment, and then we'll be done. Okay, George wants to say something. Right. Yes. So they grew exponentially, and they were considered to be tribes, and they were all the inheritors of this promise. From the first son born to the last son born, they all got the inheritance. That's right. Good. Okay, one more. Well, if we look down in chapter 32 of Second Chronicles, we read about God answering the prayer of Hezekiah and sending Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, back to his own land. And how did God do that? By sending the angel who killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. Well, that would be miraculous providence, wouldn't it? And of course, that was before the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. That was before the exile. But God's point is that God is with the people now who are returning from exile just like he was before. The days of the particular miracles, even though the prophets were still there, and prophecy is a miracle. I mean, we have the prophets like Haggai and Zechariah who operate during this period. So the prophets are there. That's a miracle. But that's about it. It's not as though Nehemiah is raising people from the dead or healing people of diseases. Remember, the miracles in the Bible are concentrated in certain sections. It's not just miracles happening all the time. The miracles happen primarily during the days of Moses and during the days of Elijah and Elisha, and then in the days of Christ and his apostles. Those are the major concentrations. It's not that they can't happen occasionally. For example, Joshua 10, God causes the sun to stand still. Well, that was a miracle, and God causes the walls of Jericho to fall down miraculously, but it's not as though miracles are just happening left and right in the same way that they are in the days of the plagues or in the days of Elijah and Elisha. Well, I really want to continue talking about this. I guess we're going to have to pass on from Chronicles for now and just say, read that more on your own, and then we'll proceed with our discussion of great themes in the Old Testament next time. Thank you very much.